Welcome to Between Shelves,
where we make connections between literature, theology, philosophy, psychology, and culture.
Join us as we explore the interconnectedness of race, spirituality, psychology, and meta-modernism.
Each episode invites you into a thought-provoking journey, unpacking how these elements shape our understanding of the world and ourselves.
My name is Aaron Waldron. We're a religiously traumatized Theopoet and a shaman in journey. Our work focuses on creating community and between spaces for religiously traumatized millennials, navigating life beyond colonized religion.
And my name is Rafael Reyes. My work is on the importance of imagination and theopoetics in philosophy and religious pluralism.
We invite you to Between Shelves
to learn,
listen,
and become.
All right. Welcome back to the dialogue. It's good to be back. This time, as part of the dialogue, we're exploring meta-feminism, which is examining femininity as a dynamic spectrum within the framework of meta-modernism. We navigate the intricate intersections of gender, identity, and societal constructs, centering the experiences of Black women. Now, when we say Black women, and when we use the word Black, just as a reminder, we've mentioned this early on in the dialogue's previous episodes, but Black is pertaining to a particular experience with the help of James Cone's work in defining Blackness as this experience that is undergoing oppression. So when we see women that are undergoing oppression, we're referring to them as Black women. We are not using the race or skin definition. And so it really focuses on those enduring and living a Black experience when we say Black women. So through these lenses, we challenge conventional and colonial narratives, exploring how meta-modern perspectives invite us to deconstruct feminine oppression while embracing fluidity, complexity, complexity, and inclusivity. So we are back. Welcome, Raphael, again to the next iteration of this amazing yet complicated dialogue. It's good to see you. Any beginning entry thoughts on this?
Yeah. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. First of all, great to be back and talking. This is as you know, we always do. We kind of talk about a certain subject in the beginning, then we have a special guest. And so we're going to have another special guest post in the next podcast. But I kind of wanted to further clarify, since you were talking about Blackness and Black women as part of our subject matter for today, even this term of feminism wouldn't fit that category because amongst those theories, feminism was considered white women, which was considered sort of like this first wave feminism. And then you get these third wave, which introduces womanist critical thinking, or womanist epistemologies and womanist theology, which speaks more towards Black women and Black women's needs. And, you know, as you're well versed in, and you've actually got to introduce here, you know, this is where we start getting mujerista theologies, and this continued growth of these waves of feminisms, but have these different terms because they speak to a very particular group of women. And so at least to start out with, you know, there is a disconnect between feminist thinking and womanist thinking just because of which categories are highlighted and for whom. And one of my dear texts that I teach from and I enjoy so much, Sisters in the Wilderness by Dolores Williams, with that womanist theology, is a much different text as what you'll probably see feminist thinkers, white women thinkers, and epistemologists, philosophers are thinking in the categories that they produce. And I just wanted to make that that highlight here. The title we have is Meta-Feminism as a general category. And I'm wondering if we just be like meta-feminist, womanist thinkings as a title and and how we think forward. Some of the texts that you mentioned are from white female writers. Some are Black female writers. And I think one or two were Latina female writers. And just wanted to make sort of that distinction to actually talk about the complexity, even within feminist thinking in and of itself. And I would want to say, this is the beginning piece, that even that shows how feminist, womanist thinkers are countering the patriarchal or kyriarchal, which we'll go to in a moment, thinking, which is not this all unifying perspective from this one space. This is how everyone else thinks, but that there's room for a multiplicity of voices with their theories and ideas that come out of their contextualized, concrete experiences, and they add to the framework. They add to this framework of society. They add to this framework of epistemology and knowledge formation, which has always been a counter because of the complexity it builds. But tells us, but that is reality, that is life, that is actuality. So I'll pause there so you can continue on.
No, yeah, you're spot on. And thank you for making that distinction too. It's interesting because on the surface level, we're two males, right? In society's view, we're two males. And some would argue that we don't have what it takes to maybe even try to have this kind of dialogue, talking about femininity, the feminine. Some would argue that we have not enough experience. And, we would just push back and say, the reason we're having this dialogue actually is because we are not the average male. We find ourselves being family orientated, compassionate, caregivers, considerate people. These are qualities very similar to a mother, being motherly to other people. And in our personal lives, we find ourselves, doing these things. So having this dialogue only comes natural from a place of concern, deep concern. The women we see in our lives and what they're enduring and dealing with and what they are challenged with just by being women. And the complexity of being a woman in a patriarchal society. And so on that note, we think a good starting point should be talking about where the hell does patriarchy come from? Where does this concept, is it new? Have we seen this throughout all time or something? It's also interesting to acknowledge how patriarchy has affected religious thought too. And we both swim in the waters of spirituality and theology. And so this background question or inquiry of how does this relate to, if not, how is it God? So when women are experiencing these oppressions and we look through history and see that this is an ongoing pattern since antiquity, at least, then we start to wonder, how come this hasn't been approached in a manner to be resolved, right? Why has this been perpetuated? Why does it continue to be perpetuated? And why are not enough males, visible, society identifying males saying more about this? Why are we not speaking up for our women? Whether our daughters, our sisters, our mothers, our partners in life, our spouses, our best friends, regardless, it really touches home for me, personally, this oppression towards women. We've even expressed this mildly in our Theopoetics, talking about women who've experienced severe oppression in Mexico, and it's just crazy how there's terms that describe the act of killing women around the world. Like this is some sort of sport or something. But it really does come from this concept, this framework of patriarchy, where there's a superiority, right, a supremacy towards males. And it's interesting. In one of the sources we put together to talk about this, it was Gender, Power, and Promise by Fewen and Gunn. This book was talking about how since the Greek times of thought, and a lot of our society is built upon Greek thought, they were primarily focused on creating a hierarchy of society and authority and power, right? The underlying factor here is power. So throughout this dialogue, you're going to keep hearing these concepts of power, because it seems that power is the reason for feminine oppression. We may be wrong, but, we'll leave you to decide by the end if you feel like that is something that is an underlying factor, that power seems to be the thing that is causing various forms of oppression towards the feminine in general. But just mentioning that book, Raphael, did you have any thoughts that come to mind?
Yeah, so when we're looking at Greek culture, there's some really interesting highlights that you can point out. I don't, and I do. I'm going to say that. I don't know if male patriarchy was the piece, but you can say that, yes, it's there because of how they structured authority in the household. So women did have certain roles to play that were higher, right? And pieces, but there were certain areas where they just had no sway in. So when you're talking about the religious system, every household had a small temple. The women were only allowed to pray, but it was the males who would offer the sacrifices, and their prayers what counted. If they had to do big sacrifices, the women were not allowed to go, and the men would lead it, with maybe if the slaves in the household would go, male slaves. But women weren't allowed to go into that. So that at least introduces this concept and idea that women were just not allowed or given access to divine gods. That means you don't have a place here. You can pray to give blessings to the male of the household so that they may make the right decisions. So you see, here's this indirectedness, even in prayer. That's there. And yeah, and so then I would have to correct myself and say, yeah, you start seeing inherently within there these power structures that would limit women and in what they can do. So they did have some power, but that was a severely limited power. And men had responsibilities, but those responsibilities came with great power and things that they can do. And I would go even farther back than Greek religion. We can see that even within Jewish religion in its formation, how there were these patriarchal structures that are there. I don't know if we can call it that, but definitely you can see how the male was the leader in many of those instances, and women were limited in their roles. They had their own power structures, like if we saw, was it Sarah and Hagar? There were these power structures within the women in terms of roles. I'm the wife, you're the slave. And if we were to focus on that, we couldn't go too deep into that, but we're probably missing out that it was the head of the household who created the situation in the first place. Deal with it amongst yourselves. You deal with it, So you can see deeply ingrained in our societies and even within our religious traditions, these hierarchical frameworks that place the male as the head, of those households and tribes and so on and so forth.
Yeah, just to add to this, just starting, it goes back as the 7th century BCE, before Common Era, in the Hinduism culture. There is a Hindu law called Manu, and it's in the Dharma Sutras. And it basically restricts the freedom and autonomy of women, establishing patriarchal norms as a child marriage, the requirements of virginity and chastity for women, and their subjugation under the supervision of male relatives, i.e., father, husband, and son. This is just a snapshot of like early ancient forms or versions of patriarchy, right? And I think you were saying, Raphael, over the years and over time, it's evolving. And you're right. There's no one way or form or version of it that we can pinpoint and say, this is the problem. Let's fix it. Like it just keeps evolving like a virus, right? We have many iterations of viruses because of whatever, the environment, the context. It may take on and thrive, or it may die out in certain areas. And so it just seems like patriarchy is something like that, of a virus that seems to do well in a lot of areas in the world, regardless of climate and economic status, even cultural or religious perspectives. It seems to be in the background of things, because if we can find it in Hinduism, we could pretty much find remnants or stenches of this smell, theopoetic smell of patriarchy in all the religions, pretty much, right? Because like building blocks, where there's certain Lego pieces that have patriarchy in it. And if we were to try to take that out, we might mess up the whole structure.
Yeah.
Just as a food of thought.
I've been reckoning with, religion is tough, right? Because it hits at the heart of everyone. And I'm really sympathetic because I've been studying this all my life. And sometimes I have a critical edge and sometimes I have a heart, and I variegate back and forth. And one of the religious traditions that I'm sympathetic towards, or have been sympathetic towards, is Baha'i, because I love its pluralistic framework, and how it talks about, the divine messengers are trying to reach certain generations and certain groups, but they all are giving this message, and they place a high privilege towards women. But when we still look at it from a critical lens, there still is this troubling place in which where do they place the women? Why are they being so specific that women are going to be in this place, right? And not, leaving it open so that they're everywhere. And I've been coming to a reckoning with that. That's a question I've always had, let's say in particular Baha'i, that says, why you want to say that women should be educated? And I say, I'm all for that. Women should be educated. They're the future of leadership, but they place them still, and it's said lightly, still under a hierarchical place. They are the mother. They are the educators. But that role has always been the role of the mother. The role of the mother has always been to be an educator for the children, has always been to be wisdom counselor. Native American, Jewish traditions, Christianity, Islam, there's nothing new. To reiterate that, for me, is nothing new. That's what women do. Thank goodness for that. We need to hear that. It's when we don't hear them that we get into a lot of trouble. Um, and and so with that, I sometimes say, have we really moved the needle that far, even within these newer religious traditions? I think in one aspect, yes, because now they say, hey, all religions, all the religious systems uh, that have this divine perspective um, share something in common, and we honor that, and we use their texts to engage in this discussion. So, from a pluralist standpoint, amen. Yes, this is great. I'm in agreement. But when we start looking at it from the more human components of equality, um, and allowing for the emergence of the divine showing itself in new ways through human emergence, LGBTQIA is there, and I don't want to go into that because that's not the point of discussion, but it falls within the space that it's still there. We still need to deal with these hierarchical pieces. Baha'i does it better than pretty much anyone I know, but then it's not like they're super far, right? They have women that are on their councils, and they have women that are the professors. And I think I'm grateful for that tradition. And they're showing us how to do it. They're showing us the right way of how we start having this inclusion of women in councils, inclusion of women as part of the leadership, inclusion of women as important aspects of the family. I just hope that they don't get limited because that shows in other ways. So I'll pause there. And I'm not hitting on Baha'i. I'm very sympathetic towards Baha'i as a great religious tradition that I've studied. And I'm going to now have to go back and read it with that lens and maybe probably get a better perspective on it.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned lens, right? And an interesting lens to look through is the womanist lens. Just two that come to mind as you were talking. Kelly Brown Douglas, when she wrote The Black Christ, in her book, she says towards the back she says, "So is Christ a black woman?" as a question mark, right? And she replies, "Yes, when black women are acting to establish life and wholeness for the black community." That's an interesting, short statement, but it's very powerful, right? Because it's building on what we're talking about here, defying the male perspective, even the male white perspective, right? There's so many layers like an onion to this thing. And again, we are not the one all be all, but we are just hitting on certain layers that we came across. Also, another interesting book is God is a Black Woman by Dr. Christina Cleveland. This is very interesting because if we consider that God is not a man sitting on a throne somewhere in the sky, she likes to say sky daddy. That's so interesting. But it's deeper, right? Like she's alluding to this idea that we've been indoctrinated by these views and ideas of believing that there is a white male, long-haired God man sitting on a throne judging everyone, and this kind of myth has built over the centuries, of course, and ages, but she's pushing back. So is Kelly Brown Douglas and many others. Katie Cannon, her book Katie's Canon is crucial to understanding how does a woman experiencing blackness express their challenges and their plights, their discomforts, their injustices, especially when, in the umbrella of feminism, this act alone does not give credit to those experiences. So that's why wominists had to emerge, this way of breathing, this way of expressing. And it does not negate or say that, white perspectives are any less, but it's saying, hold on, we were there too. We felt things too. And we find that so powerful, especially as we step into meta-modern thinking, where we're trying to go back and piece things together. If white women were there too, black women were there too, and so what do those experiences look like? Not to compare, but to understand, right? And in the understanding, we're not meant to value and say which one is better or stronger or more important, but it's to say that, both these things are happening at the same time. This is a very complex issue. How do we continue to develop dialogue and process thinking around this? Maybe we may not come to something of a conclusion in this generation, but at least we need to start something, and I also feel like this dialogue kind of is like a very small micro initiative of that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we've been talking about what these womanist texts are engaging in, but maybe we haven't really talked about some aspects of patriarchy and what it entails. I think we said hierarchy, but there are some other pieces to it. I just want to highlight that and then maybe get to it. So, like, one of them in patriarchy is male supremacy. That means the male is the one that has independent power, or has power and power over others. And that also means they have some control of I want to say sexuality, how women are to be. If they wanted to engage in some other activity, they have the power to make that happen. They can feminize men if they needed to. They can create spaces where they're not held accountable, right? So you have this male supremacy in which they control structures and structures in society, right? And they create these normative patterns in society in which they can force others to abide by laws, but then they can escape it. So that means when you have these patriarchal system where males are in control, they have control over societal powers. They have the ability to categorize and name things, right? They can demonize others. They create social normative patterns. They control economy and political power. They control what can happen to bodies. They can control how and where we create. They control what is wisdom and what is knowledge. And they control what, and they would make sure that nothing gets transformed. Case in point, the desire to maintain male-female binaries. The fear that if those lines get blurred, what it leads to. So they try to control what can be transformed and what is transformed. I think if we look at a lot of the laws, we try to just build on top of it, right? I think there's nothing wrong with that. We try to, we have something and then we continue to work on it. But I don't think that falls within that category. When we're forced to maintain that, right? We're sticking with oil production because it allows only these companies to grow without other companies having more creative ways to construct and develop energy that is more societally sustainable, right? That's one case in point. So patriarchy has those tentacles that they control a lot of these other pieces. And it's in the book, I think it's called Feminist Transformations of Religion and Gendered Power, where I was introduced to this term called kyriarchy, that it's a concept that actually goes beyond even patriarchy. And that here's all the systems that can be oppressed and that are oppressed. And it oppresses men and it oppresses women because the one that's in power gets to control all of that. Now, it just so happens it's men. So I would want to say kyriarchy is patriarchy. They're one and the same, but they're saying, hey, anyone could be there. And as long as they manipulate race, as long as they manipulate class, as long as they manipulate sexuality and social hierarchies, and their goal is to maintain the same, hey, that's kyriarchy. That's it. And I think what's interesting about that, it kind of tells you this is a perpetual system that could go on beyond humanity into artificial intelligence networks. Okay, I'm going to throw that in there. I'm sorry, because this was supposed to be a feminist discussion, but it just leads into there. And so kyriarchy becomes this interesting term to take on with patriarchy, to say these are the areas that it controls. But with that, when we talk about these patriarchal systems, I think the biggest thing it's doing for women, it's challenging women's identities, and they're saying, this is who you are. And I think in these other texts, Kelly Brown Douglas and many others, I mean, we haven't even begun to name, they challenge identity, and they challenge that identity by talking about their embodiedness, that says you don't have power over our knowledge. This is our knowledge. This is our history. And that's where the pushback against patriarchy is realized. Everything that we see emerging is a reaction to the desire for ultimate control and ultimate sameness. Because in our nature, we are different, and women are leading that charge. We are different. It's not male and what is said. It's just a leading that charge. And we start to see it in that text when Kelly Brown Douglas talks about embodiedness. What do we feel in our bodies? What do our bodies feel when we see a traumatic event? In that discussion of the Black Christ, for me, I'm another book is coming to mind just because of the immediacy of it.
In this thought-provoking episode of Between Shelves, we dive into the transformative concept of meta-feminism. This emerging framework reimagines the Black feminine experience and feminine identity in the 21st century. From art to philosophy, culture, and spirituality, we're unpacking how Black transhumanism disrupts outdated frameworks around race, belonging, and self-expression, opening up new pathways for reimagining the future. Whether you're a seeker, a scholar, or just curious about the evolution of identity in our ever-changing world, this dialogue has something for you. Catch the latest dialogue Between Shelves, streaming now on all your favorite podcast platforms. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Let's explore the in-between together. And now let's return to our dialogue with Raphael and Aaron as we continue exploring how meta-feminism reshapes our understanding of identity, creativity, and the ever-evolving journey of becoming in the 21st century.
Longing for Running Waters. I don't know if I've mentioned that book before. Brazilian feminist theologian. And she challenges patriarchy because she says in patriarchy, women are just considered a resource. And that's her challenge. Her challenge is, how can you consider us a resource? That means you consider us like oil. You're considering us like water, or that means you dehumanized us. You've dehumanized us and just says we're just a resource to continue growth. Let me pause there because I've been talking a bit. I kind of wanted you to chime in from the other texts and stuff.
Oh man, you brought up a lot of great things as usual. Um, but yes, that text, Congress of Women, Dr. Elizabeth Schuller Ferienza. Excuse me if I'm murdering it. My lingua is not too good, but amazing text, amazing text. And the biggest, most powerful term we thought was the hierarchy, and this concept. And you're right, spot on. My imagination and spirit took me to that place of saying, this is basically the bridge. This term, this concept is a bridge between the physical and the new now digital, right? So in the digital blockchain world of tomorrow, right, there is going to be some entity that is in power. This entity does not no longer have to be a white male. This is revolutionary, right? This is argumentatively part of the digital revolution. How does the power behind something like male dominancy, patriarchy transcend now into a realm, a dimension of living that is not focused on physical, but now focused on these digital things, these tokens, if you would, symbols, digital symbols. How do you now establish control in that setting? Control to that extent is what we're dealing with here, people. Like we have to start understanding that these are just beyond the books. The books are highlighting what's happening as we're moving on this earth. We are stepping more into a digital age, whether we like it or not. And this concept of dominancy is like not going anywhere. That's what we're saying. It's going to be in that space too and be under a different name. And, she brought up this term that was, of course, ages ago before this kind of even thought of a digital age. But you can see that even this concept that it transcends the human body. No longer is it just, this physical white male that resembles Greek ancestry even, or Greek authority, because a lot of this is coming from that language that she brings up too, starting in the Greek, philosophy, writings, in the laws, and even saying how economy, right? Like how do we even understand economy? Like this Greek word, has deep meanings. And like you mentioned, it's the head of household. Like, how do you manage a household? And that's, essentially what economy is understood through these lenses. And so when you say a white male, or back then a Roman Greek male, was the head of the household, regardless, we're living in times now where it's similar. We have remnants of that, like where the male makes more money than the female in some aspects, or a lot of aspects, but it's changing
Still,
slowly. Yeah, but
absolutely.
it's still an issue. Exactly. Not getting paid equivalent to your value. Like, and then, we see in the Handmaid's Tales, an amazing dystopian text, right? That,
Yes.
that warns us that this could happen if you mix certain things like religion or perspectives of religion with economy and politics and government and control, right? All areas of control. And you see what happens when you start controlling down to the T what people are doing, saying, believing in, eating, living, like all these things. It's not that far off, right? Go ahead, please.
No, it's curious that you talk about blockchain. There's a particular author by the name of Rohitha. I forgot their last name, but blockchain is as exclusionary as capitalism and patriarchy because they're individualizing stuff, right? And they could say, "Hey, we provide more value," but that also means I can buy as much as I need, and I can then say it's all mine. Not only physical things like land, which once again, there's that problem, right? But now digital, which is virtual, which, as when you shoot the computer down, then it's done. It's no longer exists. But now they can sue because you did that. But anyway, this idea that blockchain is supposed to be a democratic tool can actually be seen as an exclusionary one as well. And that's looking at it from a feminist lens. Once again, that has to be food for thought. We have to include that. That's how they see the system running, unless we have feminist, womanist ideas that shape blockchain, that shape all these digital journeys that we're going on to help us democratize, or to better yet, to make it human. Because to have just a male lens is not human. So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there as just a food for thought on, and I think it aligns with what is being said in the other texts, and I'm not doing the other text justice. I want to say everyone has to read them, and really what I do is as I'm reading them, I'm eking out like pieces that for me I find important. Like in the book After Patriarchy, I forgot who the author is. They really do a good job of saying how patriarchy is seen in social hierarchies. We see it in the historical perspectives in scripture and in history, how we just mentioned households, in war, in politics, that has always been a strong male lead. And then when we see women, funny, interesting enough, when we see women as slave women, as women that's giving birth. And that's purposefully, right? Because that is, in our minds, indirectly, it's that symbol as that's who you are, right? You give birth to my children, my property. But that's all you do. And probably why there's a hatred for women liberationists like Harriet Tubman, because she counters so much what white male slave owners were doing, or these patriarchal slave owners. She was free, and she was freeing others, and she was a woman. And she led, afterwards, I don't know if she led an army, but she was continuing to spy and these other things. She has a rich history we have to go into. I think, so I think there, we see men there, and we see patriarchy there. I think we see patriarchy in these economic systems that just say, hey, you just need to work harder, right? You need to work harder, and that those who work harder are the ones that are favored. I want to say that favoritism is a patriarchal notion. Like God favored David. And I'm like, this dude was a womanizer, right? But if a woman were to do that, she gets stoned, or, I forgot who was there's a passage of scripture where the female married one of the sons, and he would ejaculate. He wouldn't be with her. He was killed. Then another brother went in. He was killed. The father sends her away. He goes to a place to retreat in and meets up with her and impregnates her and stuff like that. So there's this big play, right? I say, look at the spiritual aspects of it. No, look at it from that feminist lens of power and of these symbols that they're trying to highlight what women are, and how we need to speak out against it. There's a double play there. There's a double play of what favor is. there's a lot of other pieces: who's chosen and who's not chosen, hierarchies, who are leaders in political spaces. All of those things are highlight historically for us these patriarchal powers and what they're trying to push back against. Because what's not talked about, and we see histories of, maybe in cultural settings, that there are matriarchal systems that are just as successful and are sustainable. But they get ravaged because you want these empires and, to take over land, things of that nature. So, I don't know what to say now. Now I'm kind of depressed in this podcast. so if I can segue, I think a question that these texts at least really sober us into, from a feminist womanist lens. They allow us to see ourselves. They're putting a mirror up and saying, this is who you are. And I would have to say, this is who I am, because I can fall back and do that at any time. Right. And so then a question that comes up for me is, then how does a meta-modern framework of thinking help me to challenge my own perspectives, right? And seek sort of like this new synthesis of breaking away of old frameworks and engaging in dialogue with these other groups. And so I think that's where, some terms, I was looking back at some of the stuff we've talked about, and there has to be a rearrangement of priorities for male frameworks of thinking. And I think you said it clearly. This is not going to be a switch, right? This is a practice, and this is a lifelong practice, and it's going to be a multi-generational practice for our young boys, our young men, even for our young women, young girls, young women, because they are just as indoctrinated as the boys are. And I think one of the things I would to bring into discussion is sort of the fluidity that women bring that men also have. They have this fluidity in terms of identity. It's not fixed. The way I always think about it, we have these multiple roles, and they show up as needed, and we can be tender, and we can be protective, and we can be loving, and we can be supportive. And I think that for me, that's fluid. I can show my animus in one aspect and my anima in another one. And for me, that challenges this gender perspective that although I may have a certain body part, that doesn't define who I am, and what roles I play, and that it's fluidic in that sense. I don't know if you wanted to share your thoughts.
Yeah, that's amazing. You made us think of one of the sources we put together, the Book of Lilith by Dr. Barbara Black Culta. Amazing book. It really helped me in terms of perspective. When you mention how this method, this approach is going to be so intergenerational, we're thinking of like this very large process of shadow work, right? Like our people have to go into the darkest aspects of what we know in our reality and what we know as ourself. And we have to face these things. And in this book, she really helps and anyone, but particularly me, when reading it, with understanding the Genesis story. So now we reimagine. And so, the act of Sankofa, right? This African proverb, going back to retrieve so that you can build tomorrow, the future, in layman's terms. Um, for me, going back to Genesis and seeing the whole story or myth between Adam and Eve, right? And saying, oh, wow, like it's very well possible Eve was not the first woman. And then this really opens it up theologically, right? And it makes it more complicated. It makes it more interdimensional, because now we're saying, okay, if Eve was not the first, and let's say, like in the book, the first woman was named Lilith, or symbolically represented Lilith. And Lilith was this untamable, uncontrollable, entity or symbol of woman or feminine. It very well is possible that the writer of the story, being male dominant, said, we can't tell this version. We have to tell the version that Eve was the beginning, and Eve is now the male's creative, imaginative symbol of what woman should be, the perfect woman. And so then they come in and say, well, God created the perfect woman on the second go, but we're going to say it was the first go because God's perfect. God doesn't mess up. If people were to realize or start to believe that God created Lilith before Eve, symbolically alone, this has huge ramifications theologically, sociologically, even through the feminine gender itself as it understands to identify amongst or with male, And it's like, wow, this is crazy, because for me, for the longest time, we were under the influence that Eve messed up, and Eve did the first flaw, and Eve disobeyed God, because God's only command in the myth goes, you shall not eat from this tree, the tree of knowledge, right? For some reason, God didn't want Adam and Eve to know from the tree of knowledge. And so that even then, strikes curiosity as I'm reading the text, like, oh my gosh, like it just seems like this story has been modified for like a child, to understand. What do you think?
Just one quick piece. I want you to continue. But even the explanation, Eve is not responsible because the order wasn't told on her. Automatically, what it does in the mind is to say the male is the leader, the female is not. So even in that sort of explanation, we see a hierarchical order established in there, which then creates a problem, right? Problematic. That's all I wanted to kind of highlight as you're talking. So please continue with Lilith.
Yeah. And so with Lilith, understanding that it's very well possible that the first symbolic woman was this untamable, and we keep focusing on this characteristic, right? She was wild and untamable. This is not a bad quality, right? Seems natural, right? Like you stumble upon some natural Mustang horses in the wild, right? Do they naturally know that humans ride on their back? No. That's a form of training and relationship building, domestication, and so this wild aspect, right? That's highlighted in Lilith, like this rawness, like she just wants to be herself. And that is perceived through the male as, no, you're going against order. That's chaos, like that's problematic. And then you have to say, well, why would that be problematic if not because the man wants to be in charge? And if I allow you to be wild in yourself, I can't control you, or I can't control my environment, because now I'm equal, or now maybe I have my own insecurities that don't help me to see that I could be just as wild, or we could be wild together. But there's an aspect where I feel like I have to make you conform to whatever it is I feel safe with. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
As you're talking, and I think you mentioned that, I just gotta lift it up. Everything that we're talking about is still the male perspective. So even when we're saying Lilith is uncontrollable, I need to do it, guess who's talking there? It's the male. So even the concept of she's wild is a male concept, something that they could not absorb or deal with. So we're looking at male fear, at the power of what we see naturally in nature. I was going to say chaos, but then I'm saying no. That could be considered diminutive, marginalizing, and I don't want to say that too. But if we were to look at chaos as what we see before us, as in everything that it is at one moment, right? That does not have the order that we want. Is that's what it is. And when we see the female, that's that. And so, the Genesis text is about order. It is about establishing order. And what's unfortunate, the establishment of order does hierarchy. And even in religion, they do not know how to do it any other way. Can I say that?
Yeah,
You're on mute. Okay.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? Because if we've gone over a history at least worth a millennia long, and we see this repeating pattern, it doesn't seem that it's happening by coincidence or by accident. It does seem very conscious and deliberate. And this is what really drives these feelings, right? Even amongst these feelings is anger, because there's an aspect of this that you are doing this knowing better, knowing more than me. You're still doing this, and we just, with our limited information and perspectives, we look at this and say, how could you do this? And then we immediately say, you're evil. You have to be. How do you know better and you still choose to do this, knowing the outcome? So like there is that feeling that we cannot really ignore. There in womanists and in feminism period there's anger, and obviously we can't lead with that, but we have to acknowledge that it's there. It's in the shadows with Lilith, right? It's in the shadows, those feelings of unresolvedness, right? If we could say that, like there's many things that are just still unresolved in relationship with women. Systems in relationship with women, men in relationship with women, women in relationship with women is a big one too. It's almost up there with black on black crime. Like, why is this even a thing? Like, why are we putting each other down? And we see that, these are all brought upon by these strong concepts of thought, frameworks of thinking that outlive so many of us, that are still going to outlive us. It is a little scary. Earlier in the dialogue, you mentioned like, this is kind of, depressing. You're right. It is. And that is an aspect that I think a lot of us have to acknowledge through a meta-modern kind of spirit. Like, we have to embrace this awkwardness, the weird and eerie, right?
Yes.
We have
Yes.
to embrace that, because in that weird and eerie is these feelings, right? And these feelings are very complicated. They're evolving. They're in process too, so it's not just like anchored in absoluteness. We did want to bring and invite Tracy West into this dialogue with her book on solidarity and defiant spirituality, African lessons on religion, racism, and ending gender violence. We have a treat for you guys because she's actually going to be on the next episode. We were honored with her gracious time and wisdom. So that's going to be a very impactful and more in-depth extension of this dialogue. But really briefly, in this book, what we loved the most was she was touching on how this thing where we've been talking about patriarchy, in its many iterations, whether you see it economically, through capitalism and human trafficking and money laundering, all these things. But then you also see it in the very mundane. And she's bringing up how there are people in South America, that they actually have no other options to make a living other than to sell their bodies, and they become these prostitutes or these very dark, secret tools of sexual pleasure to these rich and wealthy tourists, so like there's this global um, movement of, and it's been going on where, these wealthy people with power, particularly males, but and it's interesting in her work, she brings up it's not just males too. Like there's also, into, queer as well. Like, so like this concept of patriarchy touches everything. Like we've been saying, like, it doesn't say, oh no, that's too bad, I don't want that. No, it wants everything, it wants everything in its shade and context. And she talks about how, men and women are struggling to make a living, and they're pushed into these positions of experience to say, this is the only way I can make a living is to sell my body to these wealthy tourists, and they get to do whatever they want to me and my body. And I'm just that. Now imagine you live that, and that, what kind of effect that has on your psyche and your spirituality. You know what I mean? How is that uplifting? Like what things are being put in place to give people an additional option? It just seems like she brings up this issue where it's happening not just in South America, but in Africa, Europe, even in some parts of Asia, the Asia Minor, that people have no option but to sell their body. Like this is very disturbing to me. I just want to put that out there because I just couldn't imagine, like, if I could do something, that I wouldn't do something to change this. Like if some person in power, say in the government or something, or they know of these things but don't do anything about it, like it's just I can't sleep well with myself. I can't rest well knowing, that these things are happening. And there's no age limit, Raphael. This is what's blowing my mind. We have kids, man. Like they're doing this to kids.
Yeah.
It's crazy. I'm sorry, but but this book is so powerful because it does offer this very, you could say, kind of theopoetic Lilith shadow kind of perspective of what's going on, in terms of gender violence, like, and gender violence, men are being attacked just as much, as women, but women are being attacked a lot too, like, and so we just wanted to clear that. What are your thoughts on this?
No, it seems to be that then this term kyriarchy is much more prevalent than patriarchy, because it's how anyone can fall into that position of power as long as they have economic wealth, if they're within a certain class and have a set of resources that gets them to those, what they're looking for, in which they can do it. It's really interesting because it seems that you need to be in a highly controlled environment to get the resources you need, but then they go and do the most unorderly thing, right? How dare anyone touch a child, right? Or do some things of a sexual nature to an underage child, because those are one of the components. But they may exist within a very orderly society, highly structured business, very strict set of rules, a very strict political agenda, and then those two are juxtaposed, right? I'm for children, I'm for everyone has to follow these rules, but because of their wealth and power, whoever they may be, male, female, whatever, they can exit out, do whatever they want to these set of people, and then go back without ramification, without consequence. And at the moment, all out in the open. Because it is secretive, but now it's starting to show itself that it's all out in the open. That's real. And I think this is where this curiarchal power is showing itself. I just want to create another connection. Not that it's a solution, but it's another connection of Foucault, where he talks about sort of like this web, this social web, that you could just put anyone in there. Male, female, Latino, Black, whatever it is. And in that position, they go with whatever's there, right? So if you have a position of power and a position where you have all these economic resources, political resources, and you are existing within that societal structure, then you're going to tend to do the things that they do regardless. And you see that. And you see that.
Yeah, it does become like a question of how much does my environment affect me and how much do we affect our environment. Yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah. But we didn't touch on some other parts, and I just want to briefly say this one thing. I think also when we read and take on feminist womanist lens perspective, and we also try to use meta-modernism, I want to highlight that they both talk about paradox and ambiguity, right? That because there's no one perspective, because there's no static categories, we're forced to put these contradictory or paradoxical concepts together. But I think both of them are realizing something beautiful, which is tapestry. They both talk about tapestry. There was a feminist philosopher where she talks about the quilt, and a quilt is not uniform, but there's so many different designs within it. And then when you lift it up, you see the beauty of the tapestry that is there. And so there is in that paradox, ambiguity, historical ugliness, historical beauty, and all these things. And it highlights another component of meta-modernism that we see in feminist thought, which is interconnectedness. There are these collective voices that we can hear at once. And meta-modernism calls us to do that, right? That it's not supposed to be this one uniform voice, but this many voice that pushes against hyper-individualism and everything that mattered. But there's a multiplicity of voices there. And I think those are some connecting points with feminist womanist theories and what's happening in the fourth wave, because there's a fourth wave and fifth wave that's coming out, and how meta-modernity walks alongside of that. And I think they share some interesting components there.
Yeah, definitely. Could you, as we wrap up, could you elaborate on your definition and meaning, or how you perceive the walking alongside? Because I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, we actually talked about that before. We could look at the passage of, take my yoke upon you, my burden is easy, my load is light. I don't want to use that. I think there's a limit on that. I think if you are a Christian and we can say, well, then we walk along with the divine, and there's this walking together. But then you're kind of saying, I'm taking that yoke. I'm taking whatever you're saying, and that's it. When we're looking at, like, say, feminist voices, womanist voices, the challenge is to patriarchy, and they're not so much. They're saying, because of the ugliness that has come out of it, and the trauma that has come out of it, I can't walk with that. Right? So when we say, well, meta-modernism is a tool that you can walk with, well, we got to be careful about what we mean by walking with, right? And so I don't take it as a yoke, and saying just take these perspectives along, just take it and use it, and you'll see that it's good. But I'm saying, yeah, walk with it and challenge it, engage in a sort of mediator like discussion and saying, this is how I feel and this is how I feel. Well, what's really at the crux, right? At what's really important here that we need to hold on to, and what can we throw away? And having this type of challenging conversation between meta-modernity and maybe even calling out meta-modernity on some of its weaknesses, which we try to do, right, with race, and saying, it's useful here. But at the same time, when we do walk away from it, we still hold on to feminist theory, womanist theory, third, fourth and fifth waves, but maybe just with an expanded understanding that here's another tool set that I've learned something from, that I've garnered some other terms and words and ways of thinking about it, and that it better informs me. And so I think that's the beauty of walking with someone, right? You're not here to fully make them do the 360, 180, but rather to inform in some way their thinking, but they have the choice whether to take it or not. And that's what I think walking alongside is all about. There's no guarantees on that. I think that's what ambiguity is about. But at the same end, there is hope and there is optimism in that walking with, right? That is not going to be all negative. There are challenges to it, but that's the joy of walking with someone, right? I think that's the joy of engaging in that discussion, and that challenge in the walk. That those uphill climbs, or walking in those uphill climbs on a mountain with trees and these roots and these other things that get in the way, or if there was a rainstorm and it's slippery, because then walking together says, oh, it can help me in certain parts, right? That walking with can help me tackle this component of the walking up the mountain. So I see those benefits there.
Powerful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You made me think of how the mother is this great example or symbol of, the best of what femininity has to offer, right? If we are the consumption of yin and yang, right, the feminine and masculine, then it's like the mother doesn't just have all femininity, but masculinity as well. And it's interesting because masculinity represents action. And me and you've been talking about this, how does feminine symbols take action? How have they taken action, and what actions have been taken against them? And that's interesting. There's this in patriarchy, this masculine energy that's, pushing against others, not just women, but in this context, women, and then we have to consider the feminine aspects of, the empathy, the compassion, the patience, the willingness to, seek each other out, or seek harmony amongst others, among differences. I think that's a very motherly concept. I don't want to stereotype it, but I'm just saying, from my limited experience as a human being, as far as we remember, you don't really see that from a father too much, as a father symbol, or a masculine symbol. It seems like it comes from a more feminine, mother-like symbol. You would find any remnants of that action, like one that wants to bring people together or keep people together. One that mediates, like you said, family, dynamics and issues. So yeah, it's really interesting, is all we're saying, this overlapping, that's not a coincidence. It seems more like an interconnectedness, if anything. And from a spiritual note, the loving yourself is sort of like being a mother to yourself too. And we found that very interesting with talking about feminine and masculinity. Maybe part of like our colonization or the indoctrination of colonial imagination is us not embracing our femininity, our inner mothers, our inner ability to mother ourselves, be compassionate, patient, empathetic towards ourselves, because it's interesting that a mother can do these things, but it seems like they can only do it if they do it for themselves. Like I don't think it works the way that a mother can just do these things, but not do it for themselves. Like a mother that hates themselves, but loves everyone else. That just seems imbalanced. It seems, how's that even possible? My inquiry would come up. How do you understand love if you don't love yourself? And so that's why like the mother energy, that feminine energy is so attracting. It's like everybody wants some honey and some milk, like, because it's just like, it comes from sort of like the source, no? What do you think about that?
So with the question you brought up, made me think about, we can long for loving self, but we serve the other. And in some way we deny ourselves. Because here's where I'm coming from. I was in a panel discussion. I wasn't in the panel. I was seated, but one of the questions that a professor brought up, it says, when you think about self-interest, that's always been considered a sin. Self-interest is a sin, theologically. To care about yourself could be considered self-interest and therefore a sin. So you can long for self-care, but because it's considered sin, you may not want to do that if you hold on to hierarchical powers. And so then it's always an outgoing piece. I can care for others and love others on that piece. And all I'm left with is longing. So I may function in presence because I have absence. Now, is that a healthy thing? I can't answer your question. I think the answer would be no. The answer to that would be no.
Yeah, that's powerful, man. That's a drop the mic statement. Yeah, you're right though. In many ways, it's all just a reflection, right? Carl Jung would suggest, we're just looking in the mirror, so to speak. There's anything we have disgruntledness with, it's in us. And so like theopoetically, when we're mentioning these things, like the issues of patriarchy, it's in us, and that's what we're struggling and battling with. We're not really out here fighting people. We're fighting these notions and these frameworks in our mind and ourselves, and that is the deeper battle. It's interesting.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, all right. Well, on that note, yeah, this is all we got for time today. And next part of the dialogue, we're going to be honored with Dr. Tracy West. She's going to be not only talking about her book that we were highlighting, but she's also going to be talking about her incredible work that she's been doing for a very long time, highlighting and navigating gender violence, especially within the theological community and perspectives. So that's going to be really interesting to get into, especially as meta-modernism walks alongside our upcoming dialogue. As usual, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being part of this journey. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.